Everybody, nice to see you. I'm Lillian Sims, the Director of Medical Student Research with OME, and I am here with Dr. Brett Comer, who's the Program Director for the ENT Residency Program here at UKCOM. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Comer.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
This video will be sent out and saved for our M1 through M4 medical students. A lot of students watching this might be first or second year students who haven't had the chance to meet you yet. Can you share anything that you'd like them to know about yourself?
Name is Brett Comer. I am an otolaryngologist, and within the field of otolaryngology, I'm actually what's known as a rhinologist. So I'm an anterior skull-based surgeon and do a lot of revision sinus surgery, most of it endoscopically. I've been at UK since 2014. I was in private practice for a couple of years after fellowship and then came back to UK. I'm the residency program director for otolaryngology and have been officially since 2016, although functionally I was doing it since 2014. And then also, I'm the vice chair for education. So that involves not only being a residency program director, but also coordinating a lot of the students who come through, ranging all the way from high school students all the way through PhDs and fellows of other programs. So I would say a lot of trainees that we take care of.
And I'm so glad that you describe your role in detail here because we've talked before about research a lot. And sometimes students assume that an academic physician only does research and sees
Yeah.
patients. It sounds like a lot of your career is built around being an educator.
That's 100% correct. I honestly am not much of a researcher. Now, I'm going to qualify that in a second, but I primarily, when I thought about academic medicine, it was more of the approach of I like some of these high-end skull-based cases, doing a lot of revision sinus surgery on people. So that was the primary attraction to academic medicine. And I think it's important for the students who may be listening to realize that this so-called triple threat that used to be, the overarching goal of all academic physicians, that's probably not much reality. By triple threat, I mean somebody who's a very busy, robust clinician, somebody who's a big time researcher, maybe NIH grants and things like that, and also a master educator. It's certainly there are people like that out there, but it is awfully hard to do, and a lot of times there's some sacrifice on the maybe the family or personal side of things for those people who are able to manage all that. I personally believe a person can be pretty good at two of those three. It's not that they're bad at the other one, but it's I think you can really focus on two of those three. But it's this day and age, if you're wanting to have a family and things like that, it's pretty difficult to focus on all three at once. So,
Yeah. That's really inspiring. I know we have a lot of students interested in teaching and educational roles, so it's exciting to think about making that a key underpinning of your career.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
the main reason we're talking to you today is because of your program director role, but some of our first year med students may not have heard a lot of that terminology before. Can you share briefly who's kind of in the room at the point where you're deciding who to pick for your program? You run the residency program as the director. Tell us a little bit about those that group.
Yeah, so over the years we modified it a little bit, and I think it's for good reasons we modified it. But ultimately, the buck stops with me for choosing people. But the process actually starts earlier in the medical school years. Oftentimes, we'll have a M1 or M2 who come in and say, "Hey, I'm maybe thinking about this specialty." So they'll meet with me. We have them meet with our medical student research director within our department. We have them meet with our medical student clerkship director in our department and try to give general timelines, kind of what's involved in otolaryngology. And then as they get, if they continue to be interested, getting into the late third year, early fourth year, you'll end up doing what's called away rotations. That's generally you do one at your home institution and then you do two to three at outside institution. And it's kind of like a 1 month addition at all these places. Applications typically go in about the middle of September of your fourth year, and then the programs of whatever specialty you apply to, they have about a month and a half to make some decisions. In our case, we have a whole committee that's involved in this. Myself and our associate program director, who's kind of like our second in charge for the program, we will review all the applications that come in, and then we will try to whittle down just a little bit and send it to our application committee, and then they will rank the applications they get, and then we will make some ultimate choices. Typically, with the away rotations, we have somewhere around 20 away rotators, sometimes maybe 20, it's 25. For the applications that come in, we usually will select about 32 to 36 that we will actually physically interview in the winter months, typically December and January. Um, we currently do not bring our away rotators back to interview in person because my attitude is you've been here for a month, you know if you want to be here or not. And we kind of feel it goes the other way too. And it's expensive, right? To travel. And otolaryngology, virtually everybody is interviewing in person once again. The kind of the COVID lag of doing virtual interviews is gone from otolaryngology. I can't speak for other specialties. And then rank lists go in February, and then the match typically is right about the middle of March every year.
Wow.
And so that's kind of a general timeline for how that works for otolaryngology.
I think it's good for students. A lot of times when I'm talking to them, I think they envision this very like robotic process of being evaluated, this very
Yeah.
mysterious thing, but they're being evaluated by real people at the institution that they
Yep.
did training or did away rotations. They're real humans looking at you like another real human.
Yep.
Now I know it's tough with otolaryngology because you are pretty competitive. Let's kind of have some real talk about that.
Sure.
There's a lot of applications. I think is it safe to say, let's see what I've got, about a third of students get an interview, and that's if they signal, which means they have a certain number of programs
Yep.
they can say, I really want an interview. What would you
Yep.
share for an M1 who maybe has no idea how competitive it might be?
Yeah. I'm going to go back to the application thing first. At our program, we physically look at all the applications because I think it's a little disingenuous to ask people to spend 40, 50, 60 hours putting an application together and then it just gets tossed in the can because of, some metric that you have. So we actually look at all the applications and we can get in a little bit in a minute to, talking about what we look for on those. But that is my personal philosophy on it. And, I've been doing that the whole time I've been program director. So I've literally looked at thousands of applications and personal statements and things like that. So you talked a little bit about signaling. Within otolaryngology, we have what's called a high signaling approach, which means you get to pick 25 programs currently, 25 programs out of the about 133 currently that you have a true interest in. The whole purpose of signaling was to help cut down on the number of applications that are coming into programs because we traditionally have had about 250 to 300 applications per year for 4 spots. And we know full well that not everybody has all that much interest in coming to Lexington. And so the goal of signaling was to try to better match true interest in both directions. Um, and it's done that. The most recent data from this match cycle, 2026, shows that the number of average applications per applicant has dropped below 44. At one point, it was in the 80s. And so this is actually saving a lot of money for students, and it's resulting, we feel like, in better grouping of who wants to be at various places. I should mention offhand that currently I'm also the chair for the Otolaryngology Program Directors Organization, which is the group that makes decisions about the match cycle and signaling and all that. So I'm in on these meetings that we listen to the stats. So yeah, for M1s, M2s out there, otolaryngology is one of the more competitive specialties, but when we look at the application, there's a lot of factors that go into it. It's not just grades, it's not just board scores, it's not just volunteering and community service. It's kind of the compilation of all those that factor in. And one general picture I tell for applicants is that you usually can be a little bit weaker in one of those areas, but probably not two to have a legitimate shot at getting into the specialty. So, as an example, we've been asked before, "Hey, I failed my STEP exam. I failed a class during the M2 year or something like that." I will admit it is much, much, much more difficult to get into the specialty with those, and it really limits your, because if your funnel starts out with 133 programs, if you fail a step exam or fail a grade or class, you probably have dropped your funnel at least in half, if not two-thirds or 80%. So just being realistic about things, it is important to, be involved in research, do well on your step exams, grades, etc.
Yeah, I appreciate the honesty there, and I'm sure students do as well. Before we dig in really specifically to research, I know different specialties or different programs within specialties prioritize certain qualities in an applicant, or they're looking for a
Mhm.
certain type of person. And sometimes when we're advising you students, we get really in the weeds about what your CV looks like. So, speaking generally, what to you is a great candidate for otolaryngology?
When we're dealing with med students who are interviewing with us, there are a few very significant traits for our program in particular. But if I look at the specialty as a whole, if you're going to be a surgeon, you have to love being in the operating room. You have to absolutely love it. Um, I grew up, played a lot of basketball, typical Indiana kid, and when I stepped on the court, I felt like it was just natural being there. That's where I wanted to be, nowhere else. So for people who are wanting to be a surgeon, you got to love it when you step in the arena of the OR. So that's a key thing. And if you're like, yeah, I'm kind of okay with these cases, it's probably not the best selection because you're going to spend a lot of time in the OR. Another big one is having intrinsic motivation. That tends to be huge. My personal philosophy is, we are dealing mostly with about 26 to 31, 32 year olds, more or less. Yes, there's some exceptions to that, but that's the general age range for residents. And if I, as a program director, have to sit there and constantly motivate you as an adult learner, it's probably not going to go very well. So intrinsic motivation is a big one. Um, the next one is being a good teammate. I like to share this anecdote. Several years ago, I was on call. It was like a random Tuesday night. It was like 7:30 at night, and we had a consult on the floor. I happened to still be in-house at work, and so I went up there to see the patient. It was some trauma patient that somehow got up from the ER up to the seventh floor or whatever, and we had, I believe it was two or three residents with two med students and an intern working on the patient to sew together a lot of lacerations that had occurred from panfacial issues. And I took a picture of it and I started to realize that the people who were up there were not the ones on call. And so I said, "Hey, where's the call team?" And they said, "Oh, they're down in the ORs because the ORs are still going." I took that picture because I was like, yes, they get it. They're not trying to bail out of here by 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They're here taking care of the patients, doing the right thing for patients. So that's the anecdote I give a lot to. If you want to know the mentality you need, at least for this program, that's it. So.
Yeah. I appreciate hearing that. You know, students, a lot of times for folks like me who advise you, we're thinking about what publication did you get? What was your role in a
Mhm.
program? But really, what all of that translates to is, are you a go-getter? Are you a team player? Are you a hard worker? We're just trying to find
Right.
ways to document those qualities that are actually what matters most, which is good to keep in mind, students. Okay, we're going to zoom in now on how research plays
Sure.
into the application and screening process. So first, let's talk about application stage, and then we'll talk about interview stage. I often hear from students who are worried that they might be completely screened out and not get an interview just because they haven't done enough research or done enough of the right types of research. Can you share more about whether that is ever a reality, that there's like a minimum number of authorships, or if it's more of a correlation where students have a lot of research expected for your specialty?
Yeah, so no, it's great question. I'm going to actually pull up some stats I have on my screen here just because I can't remember all these. I did some information digging this morning. And the first thing to realize about research or community service or grades for that matter is everything's on a bell-shaped curve, right? It's just like everything else throughout your life as a student. There's been people who've been the valedictorian, there's people who haven't been. There's been people who've been captain of some, Division 1 team. There's people who haven't been. There's people who've literally saved orphans somewhere, and there's people who haven't. So it's on a bell curve. Specifically to research, otolaryngology has typically been one of the top 3 to 5 in terms of the necessity of having research involved. And I will tell you, it's not that you can't get into the specialty if you don't have much research, but like everything else, when we're thinking about bell curves, the more you have, the more it's going to help your application. I've got the 2024 otolaryngology match data pulled up with regards to research because that's the most recent I have. And if we look at this data, the average is 20 total research experiences. Now, don't sweat this if you're listening to this, okay? What this means is those are abstracts, posters, and presentations. And for any of you who've done research, you realize that a single research project oftentimes will end up in all three of those or two of the three of those. And so it's not that they've done 20 publications, it's 20 total research experiences consisting of those. And that's for matched applicants in 2024. For unmatched applicants, the average was about 11. Okay. Secondly, if we look at peer-reviewed publications, so we're not talking about something that was just put up on like Medscape or something like that, but peer-reviewed publications, it was around just over 5 to 6-ish. And then of those, first author were about three. So again, it's on a curve, right? And so those are the averages. For you PhD students out there, it was just under 3% of the people who matched into otolaryngology were MD, PhD students, just as kind of an aside. Um, I will say if you compare this data from 2024 to the few years prior, it has jumped up, and there's a general thinking that this has a whole lot to do with the fact that some of the powers that be decided to make the USMLE Step 1 exam pass fail, and then the powers that be also decided to make a lot of medical school classes pass fail. And so um, I'm not necessarily saying that it's fair, but you've got to understand from our side of things, we've got to be able to compare apples to apples, so to speak. And so we need objective data with which we can compare people, and happens to be it. So those are the general numbers right now.
I can see a lot of benefits to a lot of students with curriculums and step one going past fail. With step one going past fail, I do sympathize most with students interested in competitive specialties
Right,
because you used to kind of know where the bar was and it was
right.
a lot of studying. It sounds like now you're still working just as hard as the students who were trying to ace step a few years ago,
Yeah,
but you're having to work in these extracurricular directions to get lots of research or to have leadership
yeah,
roles. But you're
yeah.
still working just as hard,
Yeah.
students.
Well, and don't get me wrong here. I absolutely realize that an applicant is more than a step score or more than a grade in a class. Totally acknowledge that, totally agree with that. But to your point earlier about some of the stepping stones or the work that people go through, I view getting better grades in a class, for example, is that means in general, especially at the medical school level, maybe not necessarily at lower levels, but at med school level, that you have been willing to sacrifice and put the work in to get that honors or that high pass in the class versus pass, or using USMLE as an example, that you've been willing to put in the extra work to, get that, 263 or whatever. So um, and we try to keep all those things in mind, but it does become a challenge because of how homogeneous everything has become because of the lack of some of the objective data that we used to have. So,
And students, remember, Dr. Comer maybe has not evaluated a cohort yet. It may be this next group that had our distinction system. So
correct,
we've got
correct.
cohorts coming up where we can more easily document that you went above and beyond academically, which should
Yeah.
help with that.
And I will tell you, program directors across the nation, because again, I'm on the committee that has all these private conversations behind the scenes. We are thrilled that the pendulum seems to be swinging back just a little bit in regards to that. I kind of chuckle at it because I'm like, we're going right back to what we used to have, just under a different name. So, but that's an aside. So,
It
yep.
does seem like a good middle ground where you can maybe get, 7 or 8 out of 10 distinctions or something
Mhm.
like that and be a great student and not necessarily have the nuance of exactly where you were ranked in your entire cohort. So hopefully it'll find a good middle ground. I do have one really granular question for you because of the competitiveness in your specialty. A lot of students are going to say, okay, how do I get a first author publication? I've maybe never done that before. For many of our medical students going into less competitive specialties, they're going to join what a faculty member is already doing and they're going to assist and be in a second, third, or fourth author role, and that might be plenty. Do
Yep.
you have insight on how a beginner student should even aim for a first author role? Is that students coming up with their own projects or just doing enough of the work that a faculty member gives them first author on a project that the faculty member had already envisioned? How does that usually play out?
Yeah, so no, great question. Usually the students who are gonna, if it's gonna be their own project where they're getting first author, my experience has been, and I don't have data on this, but my experience has been those students usually have had a fair bit of research experience in the past, undergrad, or maybe they took some years off pursuing a PhD or were in a lab somewhere. So those tend to be the ones for the first author on their own projects. For the most part, what happens in our department is a student will latch on to a project and then, with maybe not the first meeting you have with a mentor about the project, but I would say within the first few meetings, I think it's legit to say, hey, where might I fall in the authorship part of this? And most faculty, myself included, we're pretty flexible on that. I personally believe all comers to the party get authorship, and the amount of work you put in will dictate the order on things. So but I do think those expectations, like a lot of things in life, need to be laid out fairly early in the process. The other thing as a student, you got to realize is sometimes you latch onto a project and then you hear from a mentor, oh, we're going to publish that in 2029 or something. And they're like, that's not exactly what I was looking for, right? I want this to be ready for my application. And you need to understand that, particularly among seasoned program directors, we understand that you don't always have a lot of control over um, when things are going to get published. Now, certainly, if you're doing a case report and it takes you 6 months to turn a case report around, that's a whole different story. But in general, you're not going to have a whole lot of say on the timing of publication. And so, most program directors are looking for the fact that you're in the process of being involved with research. Is a double-blinded placebo-controlled trial better than a case report? Yes. I mean, I think anybody would acknowledge that, but we're not looking for a bunch of double-blinded placebo-controlled trials either. So,
I'm glad this came up though, because again, the spectrum is very wide with how much students might be involved depending on their career interests. Some
yeah.
students do one case report and that's it, ever on the research front. What's your advice for the students who are finding a lot of smaller opportunities, QI project, a case report, or they're deciding, do I put all my eggs into sort of a really big time commitment that should lead to an
Yeah.
authorship? That can be a tough call for an M1.
That's a terrific question. And so I want to comment a little bit about the nature of research because I think some students say, well, I want to go into otolaryngology, but I've got research in cardiology over here or general surgery over here, or I don't know, internal medicine over here. And what I tell students is, long as your path is consistent with what you have been telling people, that's not really an issue because we fully acknowledge not everybody's ready to commit to otolaryngology as an M1 or M2 or even M3 necessarily. What does get a little strange is if a student says, well, I've wanted to do otolaryngology since my senior year of college, and then they've got research in cardiology and internal medicine and neurosurgery and things like that. That doesn't match up very well. And so for most places, it's going to be the fact that you're in the process of learning that. Now, with regards to smaller versus bigger projects, my suggestion would be to do a little bit of sprinkling of all the above. You don't necessarily want 6 case reports, but having a couple case reports, 2 or 3 case reports is okay as long as you've got some other stuff over there as well. And the flip side of that is doing one double-blinded placebo-controlled trial is going to take 5 years to come out, and having nothing else, that's probably not what you want either. So it's kind of like hedging your bet on the stock market between stocks and bonds, right? You kind of want
Long-term
to,
and short-term
yeah,
investments.
yeah, you want to hedge your bet just a little bit and have a little bit of a mix if you have the opportunities available. And one of the cool things about the so-called Zoom era is that you've got the ability to contact people and have a face-to-face meeting virtually with people all over the country in this day and age. And so don't feel like you're locked into just, the University of Kentucky, for example, or Louisville or wherever. I have personally found some of our hungriest residents that we ended up matching have come from programs where they didn't have a home program, and some of them pre-Zoom era, they were cold calling people or cold emailing people saying, "Hey, I don't have a home program. Any chance you got anything going on, or got a colleague that you know of that needs some help?" Those are sometimes somehow some of the best connections are made, and it also to me shows some grit in that regard of, oh boy, this person is a self-starter. They're willing to put themselves out there, even though they may get, 99 no's, but that one yes may make a big difference to them. So
I'm so glad to hear that because I could see, some of our M1s being really intimidated at cold emailing someone they don't know,
yeah,
whether it be at UK or elsewhere. So that's not a red flag to you. That's actually a green flag that someone
yeah,
reaches out. Take
yeah.
notes, students. That's great.
Now, a caveat to that is if the person you contact says, "Hey, I'm going to put you in contact with my assistant to schedule things," use the assistant, please. Okay, that's
That's
a
true.
lot of
I generally tell students any interaction that comes from that, you could be judged for better or worse. Like
yeah,
they
no,
need to
it's
be
true.
acting like they're in an interview context. So watch out for that too, students. Now this just kind of came up organically, so let me follow up here. Imagine you're an M1 right now, you're looking for otolaryngology research, and maybe you have a project that's starting up a little bit later in the summer, and you're thinking, do I lean harder into more ENT connections? Do I do more shadowing or do more work to
Mhm.
try to find more mentors in this specialty? Or do I pursue something in another specialty in order to get more outcomes because there might be something in general surgery or internal medicine that I can do while I've got this downtime before another project revs up? That's a really tough decision for students because they feel pressure to do as much as they can and to network. What would you suggest in that situation?
I think you need to follow what you think your passions are at the time. So if you truly have potential interest in otolaryngology and general surgery, and maybe I don't know neurosurgery, go for it. Try to get, and then as you start to whittle down, you'll find out, but usually into the third year of what you truly have a passion for. And one of the things I tell students going into our specialty is, in general, if you prepare as if you're going into otolaryngology and you end up switching your mind, changing your mind, you're going to be in pretty darn good shape for just about every other specialty out there because you prepared as such. Um, I had an older brother who's actually a retina specialist for a major institution, and he's about 5 years older. And he always told me, he's like, "Brett, you want to keep your funnel as open as possible with your decisions." And so keep your funnel open, okay? And then you can start to narrow as you figure out what your interests are. Because if you think about, and this is true of any field, think athletics. Who are the most potent athletes out there? They're the ones that are born with the natural talent, have the natural interest, and then will put in the hard work. And if you can put those together, that's what makes the Michael Jordans of the world. That's what makes the great violinists of the world, the great doctors of the world. So yeah.
Great point. Let's see here. Talking about the interview stage a little bit. So let's say you've gotten through the application stage, you've been offered an interview. A lot of students maybe haven't thought that far ahead and
Mm.
how they're going to describe their research involvement. Have you seen red flags or green flags in terms of how people talk about research at the interview stage, things they need to try to do or not do at that point?
Yeah. I would make sure you know your research that you're involved in inside and out and don't overstate what you do with it. Every once in a while we'll come across that where it becomes pretty obvious within a question or two that the student doesn't really know the big picture of the part of the project that they're involved in. So just try to make that consistent and don't overstay. It is okay not to be making the key decisions on a project or to say, "Hey, I'm not sure how that part was done." But you do need to be very familiar with what is the primary question of the research, what's the hypothesis, and what was the outcome of it. That's a very important part. Um, I view an application, especially now that they're starting to limit a little bit what can go on applications. Um, in my opinion, there really shouldn't be something on an application that you don't have great familiarity with it, because if you got to limit what's put on there, if you're inherently, if you're putting it on there, that means it's important to you. So,
Yeah. So better to just leave something off. If it's a
yeah,
very foggy memory,
yeah.
it could work out better. We've covered such a wide spectrum here. Are there things that you would want to say to an M1 or M2 in general about, aiming towards your specialty that maybe haven't come up yet or research specifically?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I've got a couple kids, and so I'm seeing this happening with youth sports, the pressure to subspecialize early. And I think this is happening in all sorts of areas, probably music as well, and the arts and things like that. And so I encourage M1s in particular, don't feel the pressure to declare early. Um, I think that's a mistake. Kind of explore things broadly. If you want to do a little shadowing, do some shadowing. You'll make some connections with shadowing, but by the same token, don't feel like you have to be embedded within a department constantly, or I'm never going to have stand a chance of ever matching it. In fact, I could argue that being around too much may be a detriment to you, because you're not learning about other specialties and how they work. So that's one thing. Don't put a massive amount of pressure. If and when you start to hone in on, oh yeah, this is really the specialty I want to do, that's when to start getting more and more involved in things.
Mhm.
Now, again, you have to balance that a little bit for some of the more competitive specialties of you do need to be involved in research, you do need to be involved in volunteering and community stuff. And with regards to that, that doing a one-off in a soup kitchen on a Saturday morning is probably not as powerful on an application as something that's a little more longitudinal that you have true interest in. So yeah, but bottom line is don't put too much pressure on yourself too early with this process.
I have one more question that we've kind of danced around, and I think it would be good to ask. We talked about pass fail and how sometimes students will really prioritize extracurriculars in this pass fail environment.
Yep.
M1s and M2s don't know a lot about how they're evaluated during their clerkships third year, or what, for instance, step two is, any sort of metrics from M3 and M4. If they're thinking about how to allocate their time, can you just speak briefly to what are some of the measures that do matter from M3 and M4 year that maybe they're kind of laying the groundwork for as they get through their preclinical courses, and they may not even realize how much those things
Yeah.
matter yet, you know?
I think big picture wise, you got to realize why are you going into this? You're going into, I hope, to take care of patients and take care of them well and serve other human beings. And so it's not just about your application and about getting into some specialty. It's the fact that if you don't have the baseline knowledge in place, you cannot possibly perform at the high level you need to in the clinical realm because you don't have the knowledge about that. And I get it, things are changing a little bit with AI being at our fingertips and things like that. But I personally believe you really need to pound it in the preclinical years to have that knowledge base to understand why things happen and how they happen, because I think it gives you more confidence in your clinical years for being able to make clinical judgments. Um, and that's why I'm glad the distinctions are coming back, pass fail or the honors, high pass, that sort of stuff, because I think it helps people to raise the bar a little bit. And ultimately, big picture wise, I think it helps a whole lot with just better patient care in the long run, independent of whatever specialty you go into.
Yes. That's a great point. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Comer. We really
Welcome.
appreciate all this insight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right.